Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. You can find all my stuff at dailyevolver.com, and I love hearing from you, so you can write me at jeff@dailyevolver.com or go to the Connect section on the Daily Evolver website. All right, so my guest today is Jeremy Johnson, who is back after a 2-year absence for another visit. And the simplest thing I think I can say by way of introduction about you, Jeremy, is that you're one of my favorite integral philosophers.
Oh.
Yeah, man. I've gotten a great transmission from you. And just to sort of situate you in the landscape, you focus on Jean Gebser, one of the, great integral philosophers of the past, I guess, 1905 to the 70s, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have written a book about him called Seeing Through the World, Jean Gebser and Integral Consciousness. And you are still the president of the Jean Gebser Society?
I still am, yeah.
Wow. You're doing a new course called Seeing Through the World, Integral Consciousness and the Ever-Present Origin. So just give us an update about where you're at and what you're doing with this course.
Sure, Jeff. And I just want to say thanks for having me back on the show and for your kind words. It means a lot to me. As a longtime listener, growing up listening to your show, in a sense, for the past 10 years. And
oh, for heaven's sakes. Yeah. So anyway, fill us in the meantime.
All right. Yeah. So since we've spoken last, I ended up publishing that book that you mentioned and running the kind of test pilot course of Seeing Through the World. And that was last January, February. And it's coming back again this year, the course, but it's a little bit more curated. So the last year, what I did, like the graduate student thinker that I am, I made everybody read through the book linearly, from beginning to end. And I think I lost some folks along the way, this kind of getting lost in the reads, because I think, as I mentioned in the last interview, Gebser is a very challenging writer, but because of that, he can be very transformative. So in this course, we're going to be curating select chapters that really kind of highlight some of his core themes and his core philosophy, to really kind of draw that out and explore it. And there's also going to be worked in a few different practice modules to do together as a group, and a few different contemplative practices that I've been exploring since that time, to just kind of find ways to get out of the head and a little bit more into presence, right? Because so much of integral philosophy, in Gebser's expression, is a matter of presence and leaning into presence and allowing presence to kind of open up our deep sense of past, and intimately, right? Like we were talking about the presence of the future, and that happens here. And you need to be kind of very open and grounded and, in a sense, embodied for that. So we're going to be exploring what that could mean. And as we go along through Gebser's book too, there's going to be some multimedia presentations just to help people along, because there's so many name drops, art references, classic paintings or ancient Paleolithic masks, or there's just so much rich material that he's drawing from, that I think as a modern reader it'd be really good to kind of get a sense of that visually.
Well, it's so interesting to hear, to sort of place him in the integral pantheon in a way. First of all, he's living through this amazing period in history, through fascism and the world wars and all, and then also he knows Picasso, he knows all of these physicists and great thinkers. So he's in the modern age. He lives through to the 70s, he lives through the 60s. And then there's also the fact that he's a mystic. He's a true spiritual adept, and transmits that in a way that is more poetic and artistic than most integral philosophers, right? Mm-hmm. So in a way, he's calling us to a path, right? Or offering his insight as something to practice, mm-hmm. not just sort of think about or something like that.
Well, I think, and I've been talking about this with other scholars in the past year, including Mark Vernon, who's a fantastic thinker, who wrote about Owen Barfield. And I like Barfield's example of this, and it dovetails in what Gebser is doing, because Barfield says, if you look at language, And you look at the ancient expressions of the English language, it was doing something different. It had a different way of being in the world than, let's say, modern colloquial language does. There's a different relationship to time, to space, to symbols and spirit, numinosity, than, say, a secular person in everyday life would be having, not let alone a philosopher. So Gebser kind of takes a similar approach where he goes, the archaeology, the layers of symbols and language and myth and art and even thinking itself is part of this kind of processual transformation. And the way you kind of get into that and really sink into that as sort of a living thing is not just to see it in a kind of abstract way, like, all right, let's take the 1,000-mile view and look down at where we've come from. But in a certain sense, he's kind of saying, like, you can kind of walk along the path. You can go down into the valley. There's a part of you that's still in the valley, right? So in a sense, and I've been using this word loosely because, a lot of like progressive folks talk about decolonization. And in some sense, he's really kind of asking us to do that. Like, the process of becoming modern is something we should be aware of, right? This is a cultural evolution process. And the more we're aware of that, the more actually we can access these older structures of consciousness in a very embodied way. Again, the way to do that is to really kind of get into the poetic, the aesthetic, the experience in our own phenomenology. In phenomenology is like the study of what it feels like to be, right? What is perception? How do we engage with time? How do we feel like what it is to be in the world? That's transformed.
Yeah.
And so he's always like, and the funny thing is he wasn't like very aware of, because it was the 40s and the 50s, he wasn't very steeped in contemplative Eastern traditions. And yet throughout his writing, he's always kind of talking in that way. He's always kind of going, you have to like, he's always checking us as moderns. He's like, all right, you may want to write off the mythic structure, for instance, as superstition, or the magical, but hold your horses and don't go in there with, okay, is this scientifically measurable? Leave some space for a moment. I'm not saying like go and believe, but leave an opening, leave a clearing to perhaps experience some of this for yourself. And so in that way, it really kind of brings that to life without the sort of prejudice of being too far up into the
Right.
into the modern.
And this is what you are attempting to do with this course, right?
Exactly.
So describe how you'll do this. I mean, Gebser's famous, of course, for coming up with these structures of consciousness of archaic and magic, mythic, mental, right?
Yes,
and then
mental.
Integral. Yeah.
Yes.
And so to have a palpable transmissive experience of these is your goal. Mm-hmm. And you're doing multimedia and you're doing meditations. I love that you're doing, practices. Mm-hmm. So give us a sense of how that will work.
So you mentioned the multimedia thing, and I think especially with the magic and the mythic, right? So folks can reference our last recording, but the magical and the mythic, it's a very kind of experiential thing. You kind of have to just sort of aesthetically engage with a feeling in a felt sense. So we're going to be working with playing some different kinds of music, emphasizing sound and acoustics. The good thing about the structures and what Gebser lays out for us is that very often a structure of consciousness is related to what McLuhan calls our sense ratio. So the magical is sort of acoustic oriented. And so we're going to be emphasizing hearing and emphasizing what it is to hear. How do we process a room if we're just emphasizing hearing rather than sight, right? Rather than visually. But then what happens if we emphasize the kind of the inner eye, the dream eye, the image eye, right? Versus the outer measurable eye of kind of seeing during the waking world. So we're going to be really focusing on our senses and our embodiment. And then as we go through some of these practices, one of the things I did actually at the Hispano-American conference, I streamed in for that one last year, was so one of the important examples Gebser gives of the unperspectable magic and mythical world is the cave. And so we did a little bit of a visual exercise, imagining ourselves in a cave and allowing ourselves through a few minutes of just contemplative presence and inner visualization to begin to kind of feel out into the cave, to begin to feel like, well, what is coming to you? What do you hear? Focus on what you hear. Are there voices? Are there footsteps? can you reach out and touch the cave walls? I used an image of a South American cave with like all of these beautiful hands painted in red ochre all over the wall. And I just had people look at that for a moment, close their eyes, kind of go in there and really kind of sink into these visual images and allow them to kind of become multisensory. So there'll be a lot of that. And I'm working on a few different presencing techniques, just sort of very simple, like coming to be present with the group, right? Before we begin jumping in to the heady stuff or to the reading questions, just to have a few minutes of contemplative practice and sort of cultivating that sense of, one of my favorite teachers is named Shinzen Young. The sense of equanimity, right, is something that is so useful and so helpful to be cultivated when you read Gebser and when you explore these questions, because sometimes weird stuff comes up, right, with the mythic, with the unconscious, right, with the dream imagery. That could be really powerful stuff to work with that. And so rather than saying, let's be rational and kind of put a capstone and say, oh, well, the mental can help us with that because it keeps us rational and buoyant above the waters of the mythic. Rather than that, I'm emphasizing a kind of clarity and equanimity that can allow us to really allow those older structures to speak for themselves rather than be interpreted.
One of the things that I love about Gebser is, and I know you emphasize it, is this word diaphanous, right? There's this, just in any given moment, seeing through what it is to include, these other dimensions of reality that are still online. And not only are they online, but there's also future structures online. And that's where I still get kind of stuck.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
the principle of diaphany or diaphaneity, it sounds more complicated than it really is, because this is just me after a few years of really writing about this and trying to articulate it and working with students on it. I think the more we're capable of, again, concretizing is a Gebserian word, kind of rendering embodied, rendering kind of realized in ourselves, the more we can work with the different structures outside of the mental, let's say the deep past, the magic and the mythic. And the more we're aware of the mental is also this phenomenological structure that we embody it in a certain way. The more we work with those things, we start to get a little bit more fluidic, a little bit more dynamic. You kind of begin to see how these different structures move throughout the day, how they kind of come to the forefront. If you're early morning, you're waking up and you hear your pet kind of, I don't know, eating some food at like 6 a.m, and you're kind of in a dream state, but you're kind of just disembodied and floating through the whole house. And then you slip into wakefulness and you forget about that. Like, you can kind of see these little transitions as they take place, and then let alone some of the deeper, more difficult work like shadow work and Jungian kind of work with the mythic. The more you work with those things, I don't know, there's more of this kind of opening. It's just sort of a natural relaxing that sort of takes place in you after a while. And I always say this, I was mentioning this to Corey too. We talk about in integral theory, you talk about aqua, right? All quadrants, the interior, exterior, upper left, lower right. Diaphaneity is almost like the kind of the point in the middle. It's like, what is it really like to be naturally, as they say in integral theory, tetra arising, just to be. It's just a kind of poise, right? It's like being the open sky. It's like not necessarily shutting down the magic, not shutting down the mental either. It's just being open. It's a kind of a simple openness that is a kind of a natural poise. It's innate to us. And I think the more we work on it, the more we can kind of cultivate that natural disposition. And that's the key with Gebser too, is that all of these structures are latent from the beginning, quote unquote, from the archaic, the magic, the mythic, the mental, the integral even. They're all in us as like a seed, as a kind of a presence, and they draw us forward in that sense too. I don't know if that helps a little bit with this sort of, it's a feeling, it's an openness. It's an image of an open sky.
Oh,
like
totally. And it's quite beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, one of the earliest inspirations for Gebser in the 1930s when he was in Malaga, Spain, which I think I mentioned in the last interview, but it's worth mentioning again. He had this lightning-like flash of inspiration, and he was studying Rilke's poetry. That's how he started out, as a poet and a poetic scholar of sorts. And he was just so taken by Rilke's muse of Malaga, Spain. And he comments in his diary about the shimmering emptiness of the open sky. And then that's sort of his first inkling of this new attitude that he felt was opening up in the arts and the sciences.
And what year was this?
1932 into 1933.
Wow. Some dark decades to come there.
Yes, it was. And that's the thing. I mean, we talked about that last time, but he lived through Hitler's Germany. He escaped there. He eventually had to flee Spain and was nearly executed at the border. You know, he was arrested and nearly shot. So he lived through some of the most difficult times in the history of European civilization. And yet even there, like he saw the creative tensions that were possible emerging from that dissolution. And very much, you know, like I mentioned, art is very often the early harbinger of what is emerging. Art can kind of tell us because it's sort of spontaneously arising in a culture. So you should always look to the artist as this sort of organic expression of what is coming, what is becoming in human culture. And it's working out those dynamics. It's working out those tensions. So that's why he was so drawn to poetry and how Rilke's language was using adjectives differently. And it wasn't about subject and object anymore. It was this kind of betweenness and openness of things that he got so well from Rilke. And that principle he applied to everything else, you know, as a kind of methodology. He called it cultural philosophy. And it was just looking for these certain characteristics and criteria that he gleaned from the arts, and then began to look at them in let's say physics, Heisenberg and quantum mechanics and so on. And you got, you know, there's something that has fundamentally shifted about this century in modernity. We're doing something else that isn't modernity anymore. Like modernity is birthing this new world.
Did he get into postmodernity as a structure?
No, and you know, I talk about this a lot with folks too, because he died in the early 70s. So I don't really think he was really there for the major wave of 1970s literature, 1980s postmodern literature. But nevertheless, you know, he talks a lot about how between these structures, there's a kind of a Janus face quality where the new structure is kind of expressing itself. But at the same time, the old structure is still online. There's these weird kind of admixtures of the two happening. And when I hear about, like, when you look at the criteria of what it means to be postmodern, right? It's doubting meta narratives and big picture thinking. It's utilizing skepticism. It's being aware of power structures. There's a very deconstructive element to it. It's cutting things apart. I think Gebser would see that actually, rather than something entirely new, as a further extension or expression of the mental world, of the perspectival mental world. And the mental is really good at making the cut. It's really good about dividing the subject and the object, standing in spatial awareness and cutting out something through a point of view. And it's that making the cut that he's always talking about. And he warns, interestingly, he kind of anticipated postmodernism, because he said, you know, if this trend continues, we'll probably end up seeing more cultural fragmentation, where everyone will have their own little totalizing worldview and no one will be able to speak to anyone anymore. There'll just be utter fragmentation, just atomization of culture. And he saw that in his own time at beginning, just hyper specialized traditions and areas of study, and of course the world wars. So he really felt like that was more of an expression of this kind of same extended capacity to make the cut, to divide.
Yeah.
So
well, you talk about, I don't know if it's your word or his, but that one of the qualities of the modern consciousness is a crystallization. Right? Is that a word you use, or that there's a of time and space?
Yes, I use crystallization kind of poetically, but Gebser uses it here and there in his writing. And by that, I just sort of mean there's a particular orientation, like the mental, for instance, is that kind of spatialized consciousness of being a body with a perceiver in three-dimensional space. And that could be really great because suddenly you feel more individuated. Suddenly, it's
Yeah.
about you moving your will through space, and that could be a powerful thing, right? Moving away from the kind of magical and mythical participation, which is a little bit less individuated and a little bit more about group participation. That's one of the things we talk about when we go into the magical acoustics. When you emphasize sound, everything is kind of echoing and bouncing off one another. It's a kind of a reverberating whole, right? That's enclosed in an acoustic space, or a web of acoustic sounds. Let's say if you're in a natural environment. So there's an interlinking in that. The mental breaks us out of that, right? It says, I stand alone, I stand apart, and I can measure and divide and extend my will into the world. So I forgot where I was going with that, but that's sort of
it sort of brings out the words. The world's a third person.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I see it's an it.
Exactly.
And I'm not embedded in it yet. So all cool. So then there's the integral stage. How do you use this in terms of seeing cultural evolution today,
yes.
politics, culture?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a multi-layered response to that. In the end of my book, I talk about a few more contemporary examples of how this plays out. But in many ways, just the low-hanging fruit is the problem of cultural fragmentation and the culture wars we're dealing with right now. In many ways exacerbated by new media and social media, the internet, which was supposed to be, if you're following all of it in the 90s with the .com bubble and everything else, there was a kind of a utopianism in how the internet was going to change everything. But if we really take to heart a lot of what Gebser is talking about with this sort of emergence of new structures, technologies are very often expressions of the structure of consciousness. So what we see with the internet, for instance, or digital culture, is this kind of amazing explosion of interconnectivity, non-linearity, and the theories of networks, which sounds very, very kind of emergent. But then many times, a lot of these technologies are used to isolate, to segment people, to create a kind of little totalizing bubble where it's no longer a nation state with its own worldview or a particular national community or ethnic community, but now it's the individual. You can curate, you can believe the world is flat if you want. So there's a kind of way that if you run the perspectival world to its extremes, it kind of starts to cut itself down, making that cut and creating your own totalizing worldview where you can have the perspectival ground of objective reality, the it. Well, if everybody can create their own it now with this capacity, everybody's going to be doing that. So we have the flat earthers, we have the climate science, complete deniers, all sorts of interesting worldviews that can arise through this process of cultural fragmentation. And for Gebser, if he was looking at our issues today, I think he would go, oh, well, that's the same thing that's at work as was in my time, this hypercultural fragmentation that's only gotten even exponentially worse. But for me, it's sort of like they write about this too, like the post-truth world today. A number of scholars have talked about the kind of flimsiness of having a ground to stand on together anymore. There's this loss of ground, and for Gebser, he would probably say that is the perspectival outermost existential crisis that's run itself out of its own reality. There's no more totalizing, perspectival, measurable place that we can commonly share. It's just fragmented into infinity. So I would say like that issue that we deal with today, low-hanging fruit, easiest thing to think of is an expression of this perspectival deficiency, as he would say.
Mm-hmm.
And so
where do we go from here? Do you think?
Well, that's a great question too. I think part of this is finding actually ways to. I think a lot of the progressive movements and progressive theorists are on the right track with this, in the sense of coming back down to earth, finding a new shared reality. And it's obviously going to be from many different worldviews. But with the climate crisis as it is today, we're going to have to learn how to eat together and grow things together, with the Trumpers and with the, ethno-nationalists and with the progressives. So we're seeing a massive shakeup. And Bruno Latour calls this, he's a contemporary social philosopher. He has a book called Down to Earth. And he says, we need to orient ourselves back down to the terrestrial. The trajectory of modernity is this kind of globalized, totalizing worldview is coming undone. And so I think a lot of thinkers are actually kind of talking about what Gebser anticipated in the 40s, which is just, it's overwhelming to think about that he was kind of intuiting so many of these issues. So there's a coming down, there's an emphasis on the lived worlds and lived realities that people are engaging in. And there's also all these profound challenges we're dealing with post-capitalist futures and decentralized economics, and like all these things are really experimental right now. But I see us leaning into this direction, leaning into the kind of a more immanent oriented culture that has to deal with a lot of these problems, the trajectory of modernity. And maybe that's another issue that Gebser talks about that's important. And it's time. We haven't really gotten into that too much, but he says he sees the whole issue with modernity in a different light than other postmodern thinkers who critique modernity quite a bit and say, like, there's all these ambiguities that come about with modernization, et cetera. Gebser, instead of doing that, he kind of goes, well, the issue is with modernity is we are trying to master the forces of time through an earlier structure of consciousness, through the spatial structure. But he says clock time is not time in its wholeness. Time is this more interdependent thing. Time is more, as we've been saying, the living past of the magic and the mythic, these different life worlds. So the structure of thinking of modernity, of spatially organizing and spatializing and systematizing things in a kind of a totalizing view, and then moving in a certain trajectory, let's say incrementally better or going in a certain way, all of those things are not efficient enough. They're not up to the task of creating an integral world. And so there's this kind of crisis that happens. The machine, for instance, is this phenomenon that he talks about, the invention of the steam engine, as a symptom of time eruption. It's kind of like modernity beginning to kind of go, well, all right, we've mastered space. We've mastered the three-dimensional world. We're subjects and there are objects. There's now it. And now we just need to learn how to master that and manipulate the world to improve it or go the way we want it to go. Well, the world kind of pushes back. And a lot of ecological thinkers talk about this too, like Gregory Bateson. Thinking in terms of systems and networks is very different than the styles of thinking that we've inherited since the Renaissance. So that's sort of where the crisis comes in. And then in terms of speed, I think we all kind of feel this way, especially those of us who are emphasizing the anxiety around not being able to slow down industrialization. There's a sense of, whoa, we've gone too fast and too far, and now we can't even slow down. This machine is just gunning forward. And we've tried to put on some brakes, but there's a sense that we can't do that. And for Gebser, he would say, and he felt this in his own time, this onrush of history, this onrush of forward time is part of the symptom of our failure to master time through this new integral structure. Long answer for that question, but these are some of the issues we're still dealing with today with the economic and ecological crisis. And so I'm writing about this quite a bit in my next book. It's called, I think you'll like the title, Fragments of an Integral Futurism. But it's a play off of futurism, which is traditionally very modernist, the arrow of time going forward into progress and the excitement of that. I'm introducing this sort of more a-perspectival integral version of time where the past, present, and future kind of mingle with each other, almost like a dynamic organism, right? They're co-informing one another. And so what if we took a look at history and we took a look at potential futures in that way? What would we have to learn from the past? Then how would we be able to, in a sense, move forward without some of the deficiencies of the mental structure that are kind of holding us back that we haven't clarified yet? So yeah, long answer.
Well, how might that work in the contemporary culture, where there is a reintegration of the magic and mythic, at the least, into the mental, And this, in some ways, begins to be the definition of integral, of that integral stage, right? Where we have access to all of those without one dimming or colonizing the other.
That's the difficulty. That's the important work to do. And that's where diaphaneity comes in, because it's not something that we can design. It's almost like a new attitude that, in the most subjective sense, has to be realized in each one of us. And that takes a lot of work. But I do think, for starters, it would be, and we're already beginning to see this with the decolonization movement, especially in Western cultures, is a deep appreciation for animistic and indigenous societies that are still very much alive today. Yep. And there's a kind of a shining forth of their wisdom, and in some sense a rehabilitation of their worldview in ours, as if, you know, we've lost certain capacities that they're teaching us to come back online with. So I would say that, you know, politically decolonization is wonderful, but then also there's a spiritual capacity that many people in our culture are learning from indigenous lifeways. And I mean, you could look at other symptoms and traits, like, you know, the rise of interest in magical practices. And actually, it'd be good to read to you this little passage from Gebser, because I think this sort of sums up where do we begin, you know, in the modern day? How do we orient ourselves in the daily life? And he says, the courage to accept, along with the mental time concept, like time as a direction, right? The efficacy of the pre-rational magic timelessness and the irrational mythical temporicity, the rhythms, right? The cycles of the seasons of the cosmos. And he's saying the courage to accept those things. Like, what does it mean to really accept it? It's not intellectually, it's something deeper. It requires courage. And then he continues. So the courage to accept those things, the timeless and the irrational mythical temporicity. And this makes possible the leap into irrational time freedom. This is not a freedom from previous time forms, since they are co-constituents of every one of us. It is to begin with the freedom for all time forms. So,
oh my goodness,
this is where we start. You know, as he's saying, it's developing this capacity of courage to really work on that in ourselves and to reach.
Yeah, I love that courage. It's sort of an unlikely description of what we need, but it's true, isn't it? Because it does challenge our ego, just to use the basic psychological terminology. You know, we think we're here and you're there and that's over there, and that's how we build our lives. And you know, God bless us. There's a lot to be said for that, but it's not the only thing by any means.
No, and that's the beautiful thing I think about his transmission spiritually is this. He calls it primal trust. And that goes along with the sense of courage, the courage to say yes to these strange, murky, you know, histories of the magic and the mythic. It takes a lot to really say yes to that. But then it also takes a lot to say yes to the present, and then yes to tomorrow, that we are beings in the process of becoming. Yes to that whole process and be present with it. That Gebser is saying, you know, it's in us, that the yes is in us, right? The yes to all that is in us. And that takes courage to kind of make that leap and open up to those things in a way that isn't just regression, that isn't just resting on our laurels and just accepting the modern world with our modern biases. It's to accept the process of transformation as our disposition, right? As our being and our becoming.
Well, I know, you know, for me, I think of myself as an evolving being. So there is a next Jeff that is inevitably going to come online. I don't think that's inevitably in what way, but I can actually, just knowing that, first of all, is a big thing. To just feel that updraft myself, and feel sort of this calling, and to feel however that relates to the rest of the world, and to just be curious about it and see it as a koan. That kind of thing is, I think, powerful, and a really sort of a pillar of good spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially evolutionary spiritual practice.
Yeah, I think it's just a simple poise, right? It's an openness to things, but specifically when it comes to the integral structure, there are certain things that are a little bit more concrete that we can explore and talk about, right? So,
Yay.
What we're experiencing them actually as moderns in this sense because of what we're undergoing right now with this social crisis. We're experiencing them more negatively. One is we don't have ground anymore, right? There is that post-truth world, a feeling of kind of what's up and what's down. It's not just a regression. It's not just a loss of the perspectival world. There is something more complex that is trying to express itself in that lesson, in that crisis. And this is what I always talk about, that the crisis that we talk about in the Anthropocene with climate change, some in the integral circles are calling it the meta crisis because it's all of these different factors all kind of compounded. The meta crisis is actually also an expression of wholeness in the same way. And some of the characteristics of the Anthropocene that many scholars talk about, the subject and object melting down, the human and the non-human worlds colliding, suddenly coming to face the hundreds and hundreds of years of industrialization kind of thrown back out at us with CO2 levels and climate change. We're being thrust into a new kind of extended sense of time and complexity in which we're kind of enmeshed in as everyday people. There's a sense of the macro and the micro just kind of wrapped up in one another. And this can be very anxiety inducing if we don't have a sense of how to navigate that. But what's useful in Gebser is that he kind of brings us into a positive expression of those things. Like, well, what if we did embrace the post-truth world? It's funny.
What choice do we have?
we should. Tim Morton has this phrase. He's an eco-philosopher. He says, like, well, how do you know what's fake news and what's not? And he says, like, fake news will look deliberately very factual. Real news has a little bit of ambiguities. It's like a little liminal. It's like, well, there's a few factors here, there's a few factors there. We think it's this. The more it's kind of in that in-betweenness, the more real it is, the more kind of ontologically true it is, right? This is the new integral ontology that we're leaning into, this betweenness of things, the openness of things. And wherever we can find that manifesting in culture, we really need to emphasize it and bring it out more. Some more examples I've been doing with my working through with my students is reading a lot of ecological literature, but fiction, not the science stuff, but the fiction stuff that's inspired by it. So I've been telling people to read Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation or Born, and in these books, as a kind of a spiritual exercise, there's ways in which the self is reconstituting and becoming more ecological, more distributed. And I think wherever we can kind of loosen this egoic rigidity and open up into the non-human without losing all the achievements of modernity, the more we're going to have a clearer sense of what is emerging and what the future person will be, more distributed, more ecological, and more diaphanous in that sense.
Yes, of course. Yes.
So there's plenty of other examples like that, but I think that is a really good one. Just going through and working.
Well, I love that. It helps me because I often think about where are we going? Not just me, but all of us. And that's a nice picture that you just laid out there. Of it's going to be radical, like it has always been. These stages are radical.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about what happened with the Renaissance and modernity and the scientific revolution and just the catapulting into globalization over the past 500 years has just been like a roller coaster ride, temporally speaking. It happened so fast, and the changes have been so radical. We can imagine that whatever is even more intense than that is going to transform things an even deeper, profound capacity. And the idea here, though, is it's not just a forward direction anymore. That was great for modernity. That was great to get us to globalization. But I think we have to think differently about planetization. think more in terms of complexity, think more in terms of networks, think more in terms of nonlinearity,
Yeah,
resuscitating the
yeah,
pre-modern, right?
absolutely.
Integrating it, and decolonizing, those kinds of things,
Yep.
experimenting with just better economic and social.
Yes, how exciting
Um,
is that?
it's wondrous, and it's also it's like the edge of a knife, like in Lord of the Rings, right? Like we are the potential here is tremendous, and it's equal to the danger, and that just seems to be the way evolution works itself out. Crisis and opportunity. Gebser talks so much about that within the dissolution is the solution. It's very fun with wordplay sometimes. And so if we can kind of ride that edge and find our way through, I mean, that's what we have to do. That's our
Yeah,
task.
yeah.
You mentioned like talking about the twofold task, and for Gebster, it was to have that courage of concretizing the magic and the mythic, and then the courage to begin to articulate new forms of thinking, expression, society, etc., that are embodying and concretizing this new integral structure with all of its characteristics. And that's difficult, but as integral scholars, that's what's exciting for us. And that's what I always say, like, it's cool that we're looking at this, because we have to play the role of cultural philosopher in that sense of all right, what are the characteristics of this emergent consciousness, and how is it different than the mental? What does philosophy look like in the integral? Gebser says it's less abstract and it's more like kind of being the knowledge. What does that look like? He called it, he put a word for it, volition. But what does that really look like for us? Nora Bateson is always talking about how, again, the systems of thinking with subject and object and sort of Kantian philosophy, that kind of history of Western thought is no longer useful for thinking in terms of ecology and systems. So she says, how do we study a thing when it's still alive and not killed and dissected? And she's calling it warm data, right? So there's kind of a processual, there's an introduction of time to things, allowing things to just be rather than freezing them, dissecting them, cutting them apart, which the mental was great at and wonderful at, and building things, So
I mean, two cheers for that.
Sure. I mean, yeah. How do our systems of knowledge and our epistemologies reflect the new integral? And that's my question. Always, let's cycle back to that. Because I think it's very easy for us right now to fall back into the mental. It's very easy to kind of go, okay, let's go back to big picture thinking, and kind of add a few caveats to it, but not really do the difficult work of like, well, how do we express a wholeness without the mental totality, the mental stasis and arrest? That's a big question.
Well, not without it, but including it without it being the only thing.
Right. How is it no longer the exclusive locus of how we think?
Yeah.
That's a difficult question. And some people go back to the mythic. Let's go back to big cosmic seasons and cycles. And, there's been a lot of attempts to address this. And I think what we see in integral and metamodernism is another whole thing. A lot of attempts right now are kind of these intermingling of the perspectival and the aperspectival, the mental and the integral, as we try to refine and clarify what is actually emerging, right?
Right on.
And so one other example I would give is just because I saw this recently. It's called Abstract: The Art of Design. It's the Netflix show, and it features an episode by Neri Oxman, and she's an MIT engineer, and I think what she's doing in her lab is a good expression of what the future might look like. And her whole idea is to grow things and to move away from the industrial factory model and to grow buildings, and sometimes cooperate with non-human organisms to help us grow,
Great.
to grow the ceiling, right? Or to grow so nature and culture, so technology and the non-human world almost are identical to each other, that you won't be able to tell the difference. And so for me, my thought exercise I tell people is like, can you imagine an environment with people in it that at first glance doesn't look like a civilized area, that looks like a wild area? Like, what does that look like when nature and culture no longer have that boundary anymore, where that subject-object duality has been superseded, not undone, but superseded. And those are the kinds of thinkings that we have to look at in arts, sciences, in philosophy, in epistemology, all the different fields, the whole array of human knowledge production and practices.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Hallelujah.
I don't know that. I'm very excited about it. I tend to get very enthusiastic.
Yeah, I see that.
Knowing the dangers, knowing the difficulties right now. But
yeah. Well, I just so appreciate you bringing it forth, man, you know, and coalescing your people and doing your work. And I really encourage people to check it out. And they can do so at neuralearning.com. And
that's right.
Spell the neuro part.
It's NURA and then learning, as in just, learning something, learning.com. And the banner's right on the homepage, so you can check it out.
Yeah, and I'll put a link in the description.
Awesome.
And also, they can support you with a Patreon.
That's right.
Patronage, right?
Yeah, exactly, Jeff, a fellow patron.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. So yeah, you can support me on Patreon, and that is a little bit more of a way to access and talk with me. We have like a little chat room channel and a private forum, and I send little missives every month, and we do also do salon calls where we talk about some of these things, especially the whole like how is it manifesting in culture right now. Like we're always kind of cycling it back to that, and we've got a great core group.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
People. Well, we did some book clubs, and we did a movie club over the summer. We looked at like integral in cinema, and so that was really fun. And the insights everyone kind of brings generatively when they're working with integral philosophy, just wonderful, like things I wouldn't have even thought of. They're just kind of picking up on these little subtleties. And art is just such a great way to energize people and make them remember what they've developed in terms of an insight. But we're also planning on reading some philosophy this year. So we're going to read some Bruno Latour. We're going to read some Tim Morton, probably a little bit more eco-philosophy, but we stick mainly to literature.
God bless you. Yeah, fantastic. And the name of the course again is? It's
called Seeing Through the World, Integral Consciousness and the Ever-Present Origin. And it's 9 sessions. It starts on Sunday, February 23rd.
And I want to point out that you can jump on after the 23rd and still be part of it. And Jeremy's charging $150, which is, I think, very reasonable. I get nothing. I'm promoting this because I think you ought to know about it. And so check it out.
A lot of folks, Jeff, actually have to thank you too for the other year when we did our podcast. A lot of folks were just curious, like, well, I'm from integral theory, but I was really interested in what you were talking about. So a lot of integral theory folks have really enjoyed this class. It's really fun to kind of get into all of these artistic historical examples, and it kind of just brings everything to life. That was one of the things they often said. It brings things to life in a way it hadn't before. It just kind of jumps off the page. So,
fantastic. Yeah. Well, that's exciting. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining me for the Daily Evolver. And thank you, Jeremy Johnson, for joining me. And I really great seeing you, and good luck with the course and with your work. And we'll stay tuned.
Thanks, Jeff, so much. It was a pleasure.
All right.